Greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Superheroes in Color. Glad to have you along for this ride with us. I am your host, Wesley Hall. I'm a culture historian and an avid comic book collector. I've been collecting comics for a little over 20 years now. And recently, my wife and I were fortunate enough to be able to donate our comic book collection to the Auburn Avenue Research Library here in Atlanta, Georgia. And that is kind of the foundation, the precipice for this podcast. I am joined today, as usual, by my, I don't want to say sidekick, my co-host, my partner in crime, my man Morris Gardner from the library. How you doing today, Morris?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm glad to be with you, brother.
Glad to have you here. Thank you. And on this episode, we are going to talk about some lesser known comic book titles and some lesser known characters. Delve into a little bit, as we like to do, about how the title or the character that we're referencing kind of fit into the era that comic was written in. We'll riff on some of the subtopics that go along with this. Hopefully we'll give you some stuff that you've never heard of before. Certainly encourage you to dive in and learn more about some of these titles that we're going to bring you. One of the things to note is all of the titles that we're going to talk about today are in the collection in the Auburn Avenue Research Library. At some point when things get back to quasi-normal, whatever that looks like, we invite you to come down and check out the collection as well. So we'll get started here. Let's dive in. Marsh, you ready to rock?
Yeah, let's do it, man.
Let's do it. All right. The first title we're going to bring you is, I don't know if many of you listening are aware, but Prince had a comic book run. Actually, he had a couple of titles, and the one I'm going to kind of focus on to start off was a 1991 issue that Prince had. It was called Alter Ego. It was written by a guy named Dwayne MCduffie, and Dwayne MCduffie wrote another title for Prince called Three Chains of Gold, by the way. And MCduffie also wrote episodes of like Static Shock, and he did some stuff for Justice League. I think it was Justice League Unlimited, and even Ben 10 for those of you who have kids and are familiar with that cartoon series. But this was a pretty interesting episode, and one of the things that was struck me about this episode was the cover, and my man Prince just posturing on the cover. Morris, you got to see the cover of this particular magazine.
Yeah, I saw the link that you sent, man, and it's insane, because I was completely unaware of any of these comics, man. So to have this in the collection at Auburn is like a true coup for us, man. So thank you for that, first of all. But then thank you for doing like what this conversation does, elevate it to bring it to our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I just want to bring it back around to MCduffie, because he's such an interesting guy. I was doing a little bit of research on him, and he was actually co-owner of a comic company called Milestone Media. And Milestone was pretty cool because it focused on underrepresented minorities, right? To bring people of color to the forefront and let them kind of show their skills off. Pretty cool stuff. There was some other guy, and by the way, this comic was a DC. It was underwritten, for lack of a better term, by DC, but it was on a label called Piranha Piranha Music, by the way. It's really interesting. If you get a chance to come to the website to Superheroes in Color, we'll have a link to that comic cover so you can see it. It's really interesting to look at my man Prince, and that whole storyline of it's called Alter Ego because Prince actually battled against his alter ego called Gemini. And Mars, it's just like Prince, right, to write a comic where he would fight against himself.
Yeah, man, and the Prince had a culture that seemed perfectly, in terms of what he cultivated, man, it seemed perfectly fit into a comic universe. When you even look at like Purple Rain, for example, just the setup of what Minneapolis was looking like in the movie.
Yeah,
seemed to have all those visual aesthetics that just kind of fit really well into a comic universe, man. So it was cool to see that transition, from his pop culture status into a comic thing. So you see really like with the guitar and that being a focal point, to it. It's almost always looked like a weapon almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's good. When so this, like I said, this was written in 91. And I want to see what you think about this, Morris, because I kind of feel like the 90s, we had just come out of that whole era in the 80s of the, I think they call it the Me Too era, or the Me era, not the Me Too, I'm sorry, the Me era. It was all about opulence and all about excess in the 80s, right? And then in the 90s, I feel like that's when we started as a people, as a group of people. I think we African Americans start kind of coming into our own in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of status. Now, don't get me wrong, we had plenty of entrepreneurs and successful people before this, but I feel like in the 90s is where like our entrepreneurship became more mainstream. Yeah. So to see these types of titles that came out, and to see Christopher Priest do things on his own, and to see, underrepresented people started to be reflected in comics as far as writing titles and even owning labels. It's kind of interesting to me.
I think you're 100% right, man, because the thing what happens is you see not just that Black culture is rising, but you start to see the intersection with it commercially, which is exposing it to larger white populations. So you think about Michael Jordan and Nike, that's the height of this, and you think about Spike Lee coming on the scene in terms of making films, which had always been done, but I don't necessarily know that white audiences were actually flocking to theaters to see those movies. It's also a really political time too. I mean, you think about 91, the Rodney King beating, 1992, the riots, pop off. Culturally, Toni Morrison wins the Pulitzer Prize for Beloved in 93. A lot of legislation, in terms of the Violent Control Law Enforcement Act, which really started the 3 strikes and you out kind of thing. And so there was a lot of political movement, a lot of dynamics, but there was this elevation of Blackness into the mainstream culture that I think this comic reflects.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that really transitions us real well into our next comic, which was in 1995. It's actually a series, and this series I thought was really interesting because it was, let's say for lack of a better term, it was directed by Spike Lee, believe it or not. It's called Colors in Black. Again, it's out of 1995. It's on a label called Dark Horse Comics. And it's a 4-comic series. And I think in that comic, there were about 16 or so writers and artists that took place to tell their own story. And this definitely represents exactly what you were saying, Marsh, like that transition in the mainstream when we were starting to get our story out into like the public, where maybe before these kinds of conversations were held in our close circles, right? We saw it coming into our own in the comics now. So this leads up into 1995 when Colors in Black came out. And of course, this is in the collection at the Auburn Avenue Library. But Marsh, you've gotten to see some of these issues as well, right?
Yeah, I saw some of the covers. Yeah, I looked at some of the covers. The artwork is amazing in it too. Yeah. I think what you see too is really like what you said in terms of Black culture by Black people coming out as well. So it's not just this kind of facade that the predominant white culture is actually creating these images and whatnot. You really seeing people of color engaged in these comics and actually bringing them to the forefront. And what's interesting about that comic, 95, you got the Million Man March in October 17th of that year, so there was just this culmination of kind of Black culture really hitting the forefront, being on the mainstream news cycles and that kind of thing. So it was a really cool thing to see somebody like Spike Lee, who had done like a deft job of really handling both the pop culture, but truly staying authentic to his Black experience in his artwork. And I think, he was one of those people who really started to forge into the Michael Jordan commercials, the commercial aspects of that, but still staying authentic to that true Black aesthetic.
Yeah, so what is it? Mars Blackman, right? Was
exactly. The shoes.
That's my man. Yeah, and Spike Lee, us being located in Atlanta, I have to shout out Morehouse, right? Spike Lee is a Morehouse man. So I definitely thought exactly what you're saying. He kept kind of that realness about all of the things that he endeavored with during that time. But in this particular series, I told you this was about 16 stories or so that took on a lot of perspectives, and just a couple I kind of culled out when I was looking back through these through this whole series, this whole 4-comic series. There was a story called Happy that talked about how an interracial family not only got along but interacted with each other. There was one was real interesting for me, and I just want to touch on this with you real quick, Morris, is there was a story in one of the issues called Blue, which was about a boxer, but his whole perspective was talking about how it was to be a dark-skinned man. And one of the things that has often struck me, even about us as a people, about African-American as a people, we talk about the struggles and the segregation that we had to endure. But if we're really honest, there's a lot of that exists even within ourselves when it comes to skin tone, right? And I thought this story really brought that out. And I just wanted to give you a chance to speak on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, because I haven't read that particular comic, but one of the things I think Spike Lee always did an amazing job at, particularly if you look at a film like School Day, it's a intercultural conversation. It really is about issues and concepts of blackness and darkness, femininity, who's attractive, that kind of thing, that really, as a people, we have always understood, but we had never seen that conversation lifted to a cinematic scale. So it seems like that same conversation, that he brought that same sensibility. And Spike Lee was amazing too, in terms of, you think of like all the actors that he put on, from Samuel Jackson to whatever. It seems like this comic did the same thing, to where, being in New York and being in that hub and having access to those creatives allowed him a well of people to actually build, this comic series on. So it was really interesting when you sent the notes about today's show. I was just stunned, man. I had no idea. So it totally fit the premise of the show. So I'm looking to get back into Auburn and actually, take a look at, that particular comic. But that one about colorism and that kind of thing, it always fit into Spike Lee's power to directly talk to the Black community about the Black community in this kind of insular conversation that wasn't always reflective of this kind of white dominated central, I don't know what the word might be, kind of a white dominated central theme where we were the subject, we were who were actually creating it, and we were what's being talked about.
Yeah, and I think when you mentioned that, I think back to School Days, and one of the song numbers they did in that, remember Good and Bad Hair.
Yeah, exactly.
They did that whole thing. And I think unless you kind of get the nuances of that song, that might miss you, right?
Yeah.
If you don't understand what it means to totally be segregated within your own race on something like what we call good and bad hair, that's a deep subject, man. And that's what Blue brought out, man. That's why this is one of my top stories in that series.
Yeah, and the cover art was amazing. And like I said, I got a chance to see the images that you sent, but the cover art really seemed like it also captured that vibe of the 90s, that kind of vibrant, in living color kind of feel that, really kind of highlighted like color. So it seemed like the artwork and those themes created that same kind of trajectory. The one thing I'll push into, and not to overstep, but the Other Man comics was something that came out of that 90s scene too. So I think he was a powerful influence. That's a whole separate show. I don't want to delve into it. But,
show notes, I'm taking them.
He was one of those anchoring figures that, it had created a style that, really was replicated in hip hop and really laid a lot of foundations for that authentic cultural Black experience, reflected in comics as well. 100%
agree with you. And that brings me to the last story I want to touch on in this particular series. There was a story in, I think, the last number 4, if I'm not mistaken. And so when you guys look into this out there, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in number 4. It's called Front Bar for a Drink and a Smoke. And basically it talked about racial relations, right? It talked about how to get along in the larger sense while maintaining your own sense of Blackness. It talked about stereotypes and how stereotypes can translate into realities. And I thought it was really almost poignant for what we're going through right now, because we're in what I feel like is a pivotal moment, right? We're in a moment where, and for all the things you can say about our current president, for all the things you could say about, how he's affected us as a people, one thing you have to say is people that were before, I think, the current administration, people that were a little quiet with their thoughts are feeling really empowered to bring those thoughts out now, right? And you have people saying things they probably wouldn't have said before we had this president. So those things that were always kind of the undercurrent, right? Those unspoken things are being spoken now, but this front bar for a drink and a smoke talked about those things that were thought but not spoken. Whereas now we have a situation where things are both thought and spoken, right? So first, I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on, you know, how we've transitioned and how that affects us. What do you think moving forward things are going to look like as far as relations now that so much is on the table?
Yeah, I think it's just a lot more authentic. I mean, I think there's no gray.
That's what I'm thinking,
right? And
yes.
I think that was the beauty of like Spike Lee as a creator, right? In terms of the products that he created, whether these were comics or whether it was film series, he didn't separate the conversation. So when you look at a film like Do the Right Thing, blackness and whiteness is intertwined in the conversation. You know, the guys that own the pizza shop is Mookie, right? I think
Mookie, yeah, that's it. Yeah,
that works for the pizza shop. So you see this interplay and this dynamic of that race ain't just this thing that's just thrown over the fence.
That's
and
right.
Whatever. There's always this interplay and this kind of dialogue. And I think we had a crux like that right now. And I think, you know, in terms of what Spike Lee as a creator was able to, I think what you're saying, curate out in these comics, and what clearly he did in his seminal was to place those on Front Street, right? And when you see Radio Raheem, which is like the Radio Raheem thing is like one of the most powerful cinematic deaths that I can think of, right? But you know, but it played out in real life. I mean, and to see some of those things and to come back and take that same concept of what happened to George Floyd and the reality of that and this cinematic death, you know, those were the things that had always been resonating in the Black community. And
that's right.
He was able to actually curate those out in an artistic way.
That's right.
I think brought a resonance to it, to America that I don't necessarily know that it had. And I think comics have always been on the forefront of that as well, in terms of being able to start to think about some of the things, you know, through a comic lens or not comedy lens, but a comic book lens to actually engage, you know, some very difficult topics. But like you said, I think, you know, where we are right now, I think the days of polite conversation or I think people are going to be much more authentic about what they feel, how they're taking things. And it's less about, you know, going along to get along. I think it's really going to be an engaged population. And you just kind of see it throughout, whether it's voting, whether it's people in the streets demonstrating. I mean, people are truly engaged in what's happening around them. And I think that 90s had that same kind of feel because of all the kind of artistic things that were coming out. But I think Blackness was hedging its way into spaces that it necessarily not had opportunity to in a powerful way, not in a way that was, you know, submissive. It was really bringing authentic Blackness to the forefront of pop culture, which, you know, causes friction, you know, when that kind of thing happens.
It does. It absolutely does. And speaking of hedging our way into the forefront, I'm going to transition now to our third comic, our third lesser known comic for our talk today. And it's called The 9 Rings of WuTang. I bet a lot of people didn't know that Image Comics, which by the way is the third largest comic publisher, you got DC, Marvel, of course, and then Image. And we'll touch on this in a second because Image actually brought out a lot of Black titles. But one of the titles they brought out from November or so, 1999 to July 2000 was a 9 Rings of WuTang. Morris, before I even get into this pop quiz, how many members of WuTang can you name?
Man, you go. See, this is the thing. I'm an old hip hop head, but I'm gonna give it a try.
Okay.
I'm like Eric B. Rakim, you know.
That's where I am.
But let me give it a try. This is Old Dirty Bastard, of course. That's
of course, ODB is the one.
Right? Yep. The Method Man, of course.
Method Man.
The brother. Now I'm losing him. Why, how can I not think of this brother? I can picture him, the brother that was in the Tarantino films.
Yeah, I'll take you off the hook. Right, we had RZA, right?
RZA, that's what I was trying to think.
The Jizza.
I wasn't coming up with that one. Yeah.
You had a lesser known Inspector Deck. I don't think a lot of people probably know that name. You God was probably a lesser known name. Powerful, great hip hop artist, but lesser known. Raekwon the Chef.
Raekwon,
yeah. I think we said, I don't know if you said Master. You said Master Killer and Ghostface Killer.
Ghostface Killer.
Yeah. So those were the members of WuTang 9 members of WuTang in this comic were actually transformed into 9 kind of mystic mercenary type, gun for hire type characters. A really, really, it's an interesting comic. Now I'll tell you about this comic because I've talked to several people about this comic. And here's the thing about it, this whole series, if you read this, there's going to be no gray area, I think, for you about this. You're going to love it or hate it. There is no like middle ground people. I've never talked to somebody that says, yeah, it was just okay, right? It's either I couldn't stand it or I loved it. And I tell you why, it's because, you know, WuTang, if you ever like just kind of check them out in depth, they brought in a lot of different, especially like that kind of Oriental martial arts type theme. And not everybody got that, right? So the same thing kind of happened with this issue. Not everybody understood that whole mystic take that these 9 brothers had, but it was a fun comic for me to read. Did you get to see any of these covers, Mars?
I didn't get to look at those covers. And one of the things that I think, like you're talking about, it's a really good point in terms of like what WuTang kind of represents, because there's a very New York feel to WuTang.
It is a super New York
as well. And so there's a lot of things growing up in the Midwest and then being a slightly outside of the generation that would listen to WuTang. There was a lot of things that, you know, didn't resonate in the same way that resonated with other people in my family, or generation, or people that lived on the West Coast that totally flew by the radar with WuTang. But I know what you're saying, but there's still also those very powerful cultural touchstones of the karate films, which is huge within Black culture. And it's that kind of thing that you either get or you didn't get.
That's the way it was.
Talking about, the kid with the gold norms. I mean, films you could just start talking about that were just those classic. You was at home at, in the evening, and whenever your karate shows came on in your city, you just watched them, and your friends watched them, and y'all all talked about them. Y'all created those moves. And it was a stylized way those films were crafted that WuTang totally tapped into, man. I think the whole vibe just really captured this kind of essence of, that stylized way of fighting and being and that kind of thing. So it's a powerful thing. I'm looking forward to actually seeing those comics as well.
Yeah, I think you'll love the comic, the actual work in them. So there's a guy, Brian Haberlin, that did most of the artwork in there. And this guy's an amazing artist, right? He has a pretty interesting Instagram account as well. If you guys want to check out Brian Haberlin, what you'll see looking through his Instagram account is he has a definite style. He has a definite lean towards, let's say, curvaceous women, right? And he has a thing about him, and you'll see that reflected in his style. One of the things I was scrolling through his Instagram account, and if you look at the September 11th memorial that he did, I'll just call him a memorial that he did. It was really pretty awesome. He did mixed in a lot of real people and comic book characters in a memorial he did. And I thought that was really powerful. But this guy does some amazing work, and you'll see that reflected in the comic. But one thing I wanted to touch on with you, Morris, and you hit it right on the head, is that whole martial arts field, because now I grew up in the South, and that whole, during my childhood, to go out and play fight karate and that type of thing was huge. But you have brothers like Jim Kelly, right, that fought with or against Bruce Lee. You know, that was our thing. And you think about, remember in the 70s, you had the whole blaxploitation era where you had Pam Grier and Dolomite and all these guys that would fight in that martial arts, right? And in that era, I don't know if how many people remember or have even heard of this brother, Count Dante was his name. Have you ever heard of them? So he had what was called the Black Dragon Fighting Society. And I mean, especially among the African-American community in the North, the whole martial arts thing had taken off so much. A dojo is where you go and learn karate, of course, and go practice karate, right? There was this thing in the 70s, mid 70s or so, where there was literal dojo wars. They were literally like fighting against each other. And Count Dante, one of his I guess you call it assistants, got killed in these dojo wars. And that's how serious like that whole media part of martial art had infiltrated into our real life. So we were practicing and trying that stuff. So this, like you said, WuTang definitely tapped into that martial art piece with us.
Yeah, and I think like you were talking about too, that whole universe that WuTang created with that whole group automatically fit into kind of a comic universe with all these independent powers. I mean, it fits the whole thing of the Avengers where you got your own storylines. And I mean, it seemed like they crafted out their careers the way that they came at it in that same kind of aesthetic, and also with the tradition of cinematically, everybody, or not everybody knows, but all the Westerns that were created by American movie makers were stolen from Asian storylines.
Come on.
So there's the Seven Samurais, which is the Magnificent Seven, that kind of thing. And so that whole trajectory was stolen out of an Asian a culture cinematically. And then as African Americans growing up in the 70s, there was just these windows of when there was only 4 channels that you virtually were watching the same movie kind of thing. I think that curated a culture that, you know, you can have conversations about the big one, the 5 Deadly Venoms, which was like a classic karate movie that everybody can reference. So that was like the touchstone because you all were watching the same thing. Unlike now where there's a million different platforms, but then a lot of times, you know, you were all watching the same thing. And I also think there was a nice dovetail during the 70s that connected the Black Power movement to self-defense and karate and protect yourself, had dovetail in with people coming out of the military and, you know, that kind of training. And the martial arts also became a really intricate part of that kind of development within the Panthers and the whole 70s Black Power movement as well. So there's some really nice touchstones that I think culminate in WuTang and then kind of expressed through this comic, but of course, you know, also through their music. Because even their music, when you look like their videos, you think of that Method Man video with Mary J. Blige. That apocalyptic world that they in. You know,
yes, sir.
It really has a comic-oriented kind of feel, you know, and so I think that was something that they definitely did well in terms of actually translating into a comic book.
Yeah, great points. And this whole series it treats them as 9 individuals with their own storylines, just like in real life. Some of the characters like outshone the others. Some of them kind of played more in the background, but it was definitely true to WuTang. That's great. All right. So
one thing with the WuTang too, that 6%er concept out of New York too, that mystic kind of theme they had that going as well. So there was some really nice threads culturally that led to them being a very deep kind of concept when they crafted that out.
And that's why people, I think, either got it or didn't with this comic as well. It definitely plays to that. All right, let's move on to our next one. So the next one's kind of interesting one, and you almost have to check out the library's archive to see this issue, because this particular book that we want to touch on it was actually a promotional book. It was given out at different events. I think it was even given out at some basketball games, but this is a hard one to get a hold of. And if you get a chance, definitely subscribe to our newsletter so you can see a copy of or image of the covers of what we're about to talk about. But the next comic is actually called Hardwood Heroes. It's a 2004 comic, and there were actually several comics put out by this publisher called Ultimate Sports Force. And what Ultimate Sports Force did is it partnered with the NBA, MLB, and even the NFL on a smaller sense to write some comics based on sports heroes. And I have to laugh a little bit because when you see this cover, you will see people like Baron Davis, Tim Duncan, Yao Ming, Shaq, Paul Pierce, all these guys on the cover of this magazine, flying with a cape on and superhero tights to make what was called the NBA Superstars Ultimate Sports Force. It was a 4-comic series. Again, this was out of 2004. And in this comic, basketball hero, of course, this was Hardwood Heroes, like I said. And so you had those basketball greats at that time who were fighting against an evil sorcerer named Nabu, who had an Egyptian amulet that brought things in a museum to life. And if I'm not mistaken, Shaq was actually chaperoning a class to a museum field trip when this guy starts bringing stuff to life, and he calls the rest of his superheroes in, his NBA superheroes in, to fight against these monsters and demons that Nabu was bringing to life. Really interesting, really hokey in some ways, but
let me ask
kind of fun to
you, because I
watch.
haven't seen the comics. Do they actually have powers that they engage with the villains with, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So yeah, it's so Shaq, for example, and what's funny about this is most of them are I wouldn't say stereotypical, but they are powers that play to those individuals. So what's the word I'm looking for? Not stereotypical, but typical powers. Like, for example, Yao Ming is the tallest dude out there, so he can step on stuff, right? And
okay, so somebody that was a point guard would be quick and fast.
Yeah, exactly. That type of thing. That type of thing.
Right.
But if you look at these comics, they are, I was taken aback. And when my wife and I were, deep into collecting, we would find all kind of places to go. And I think we actually found this series at a flea market somewhere. And I was just, I stood in that thing and laughed at Shaq in tights with a cape on, flying across the sky, right?
Wow.
It's really interesting stuff. But aside from the funny kind of comic book aspect of this whole thing, Morris, what it brings to mind to me is there are a lot of NBA stars, but a lot of sports stars in general that kind of transcend into media and not just commentating, right? You think about Shaq doing Kazam and Emmett Penny doing, what was it, Blue Chips they were in. People like OJ who did all kind of Airplane and those type of movies, right? So being a sports figure gave a lot of them platforms to transcend into media, right?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about this, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I think it does hit a couple of points, is that I think during that time when I was looking at some of the images that you had sent me and some of the other ones that I picked up, I think that pop culture, American pop culture, was trying to grapple with how do you bring these authentic Black characters. The way that Shaq came into the league was a defining moment. He just didn't bring, another tall basketball guy. I mean, he brought the culture into the league. The way that they wore their shorts. You think about kids like, or not kids, but the Fab Five in Michigan with Jalen Rose and those kind of players. That generation of players, they just didn't bring their basketball skills to the court. They transcended, like, this is how you wear your shorts. This is how, the culture. And I think that some of these comics, like you're talking about, they're a little bit hokey. I think that may have been some of what they were grappling with. How do we take the edge off of this? How do we make it more palatable? How do we make it? Because I know specifically Charles Barkley has a comic that hit right around the time when I'm not a role model.
Yeah,
you clearly can see this is their effort to make Charles Barkley, be acceptable and be somebody who you can kind of like the Charles Barkley that is now, that everybody's comfortable with and that kind of thing, because he has said, I'm not a role model and that kind of thing. And I think the comic even references that when he's dealing with somebody in the public. And I think that American culture was dealing with that in a significant way, that these Black men weren't conforming to the standards of, wear a suit and come to the court like this. I mean, they were bringing the full culture. So you see the shorts, Jordan changed the whole way people wore basketball shorts. And, shoes became this kind of element. And it's also a financial dynamic. They have a lot more power when they're in these conversations. And so these comics, that hokiness, I think, was America grappling with, how do we assimilate, these independent Black forces in a way that we can be comfortable with and palatable.
Great word. And that's my word. That's exactly what I wanted to say. My word is palatable, right? To make them just easy to digest. But the other thing, one point that you made that struck with me is the change in those shorts. That was a big deal for not only acceptance, but for recognition in the league, that at that time, those young Black athletes were in charge of their own destiny. And by the way, Dick Vitale, which was, a huge announcer at that time, hated that change. He actually hated the change from from the Isaiah Thomas, Jerry West short shorts,
You're right.
to those long shorts that Jalen Rose and even Jordan and those guys wore. That was a big deal, and I don't think that that could be understated.
Your socks all the way up. I mean, the whole aesthetic was, that the Black culture was actually not conforming to the standards of what the NBA considered professional, basketball or that kind of thing. You still see it today. I mean, I like the Braves and some of these ways that the announcers will talk about Ronald Acuna with the gold and the way he plays the game and he played. That hasn't disappeared. There's still a struggle with that, but I think like we were talking about, those comics were a really way to measure that, because you always, I think at the end of the day, they had their eye on the bottom line. Most of these comics were associated with selling shoes or selling soft drinks or something like that. And so they were trying to find vehicles that would make everybody comfortable with it. And you can see that evolution. And I think the shorts and the aesthetic of how people came to the court was Allen Iverson, the braided hair. I mean, there was a whole kind of thing that was changing. And it's funny, basketball was a really big focal point of these comics as well. So I think the NBA, was ahead of the game, figuring out, okay, how do we do this? And those comics were definitely a way to craft that.
Yeah, 100% agree. So let me ask you this then. Do you think that where we are now in the world and the current climate of things, do you think that being palatable is still a necessary thing? Do you think we have to smooth ourselves over, or do you think we're at a point where we can just kind of let, and I know we have to maintain an air of professionalism, but do you think we have to kind of acquiesce to that level, or do you think we've evolved beyond that now?
No, I think Black culture is coming to the table as Black culture now.
Yeah.
You can see it. You can see it in the way, because I think the other thing is too, that is profitable. Is the way that we come to the table asking for a fair share of, what's demanded or what's being earned. And I don't think there's a compromise anywhere. And like we were talking about earlier, I mean, there's no gray areas anymore. I think, Black culture comes to the table fully because that's honestly and authentically what people have always enjoyed about it. Whether you're talking about the Harlem Renaissance and, the dances and things of that nature, all the way to today, Black culture's always been this driving force of American pop culture. I mean, it's just a given fact. Only now is it still that it's not being used and manipulated, and more Black creators have their hand on not just the means of production, but also the revenues that are crafted out of that. And so those conversations are happening, in every field, sports, popular culture, entertainment. But I think there's much more of an authentic way that Black culture steps to the table and says, no, we're not compromising like this or in that kind of way. And it's also breaking down a lot of those tropes. So you see a broader expression of what we consider, Black culture, in terms of from films to music, that kind of thing.
Yeah, great point. And that's why, even in a future issue, one of the things that we're going to talk about is independent labels, right? And I think what you bring to the table is so important. As much as we like to reflect and study on kind of what we'll call mainstream superheroes, recognizing exactly what you're saying, that we are there, we are at the table financially. I think where the next evolution of that is not just superheroes and not just characters in comic books that reflect us, but superheroes and comic book titles that were created by us and distributed by us, and where we're in control of that. That's the next evolution. And that's where I think coming out of, the Black Panther being created by Kirby, being created by somebody else to represent us, is where we start representing ourselves, right?
Yeah, there's some great titles for that, man. So I can't wait till we have that discussion, because there's
definitely
really great titles for that.
Definitely, we'll get there. So here's what we want to do with our last two. I have picked my lesser known title, and Morris, I know you have one as well. So I'm going to introduce my lesser known title, which is pretty funny, really quickly, and then allow you a moment to introduce yours, and then we'll start bringing this thing home. So my lesser known comic is actually another promotional comic. And I really focused in doing my research for this, focused on promotional titles because I wanted to bring out titles that you may not see anywhere else, or it's hard to see anywhere else. So you definitely could see this in the Auburn Avenue Library collection, but it's actually called excuse me for laughing, Home Depot Safety Heroes. This was unique to me because it was a collaboration between the Home Depot, the home repair, the hardware store, for lack of a better term, and Marvel Comics. So this wasn't just some little, fly-by-night venture where Home Depot printed up a bunch of comics. They actually collaborated with Marvel to produce a promotional comic, which the storyline was a little, we like to use the word hokey. It's a little hokey. It was about some aliens that came down when we're doing all these unsafe things with tools. So Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four came along and showed these aliens better ways to use a drill and a hammer. It really wasn't riveting by any stretch, right? But it was really interesting because, and I picked this in Superheroes in Color because a lot of the Home Depot staff, and Home Depot did a good job. You had Spider-Man and Fantastic Four that came, but Home Depot staff was a predominant, or partially, I'll say it was a good diverse crowd, but a lot of us were represented in the Home Depot staff that were helping Spider-Man to help these aliens, for example. So the interesting part about this, not only that Home Depot collaborated with Marvel Comics, but Rodney Ramos and Nelson DeCastro, which are like premier artist and writer, a premier writer and artist in their own, who've done work for Marvel and DC, actually worked on these comics. So DeCastro has worked on like Batman, Gotham Knights, and he even did some stuff for, if you've ever heard of Marvel's Max title, it's the adult-based tag. Luke Cage did a Max run where it's more of an adult-based theme, in words and context, in words and subject matter. DeCastro did a lot of work on that. So this was really interesting for me to see, not only a collaboration between a corporation and Marvel, where a lot of us were represented, but just how, they presented this storyline and us in it, in that staff. But what it brings to mind, Maurice, this is what I want to talk to you about, is and you and I both have been reading comics for a long time, right? And when we were talking about sports stars that have been elevated to inside of the media, this made me think about some of those old ads that used to run in comics. If you remember, like Dr. J he did a thing with Rick Barry and a lot of the old ads where he's selling Spalding basketballs. And O.J. Simpson was a huge, love him or hate him, right? O.J. Simpson was huge for selling stuff. He was probably Snoop Dogg has like ads and everything now, and O.J. Simpson was probably like as far as when it comes to ads, like the Snoop Dogg of his day, right? From Dingo Boots to what's that luggage brand? I forget it was.
Oh yeah, when he running through the airport.
You're running through the airport for the luggage, right?
Right, yeah.
And so my whole point here is the ads in comics and the offshoots like these gave us a way to elevate ourselves as well. So that's my little known pick. Morris, how about yours?
That's what's up, man. Yeah, I got two, but I'm gonna do one real quick because I think it touches on what you just said. But I want to talk about that Judgment Day that we use kind of as like an image for the promotional stuff for our discussion, because it's a powerful piece, and I think it is maybe known by a lot of people in comic culture, but it may not be known, by a lot of people just in general. But the sci-fi story Judgment Day was in the Incredible Sci-Fi Fiction #3. Came out in 1956, but it was a reprint from a Weird Fantasy number 18 that came out in April '53. And it's a basic story, pretty simple. A human astronaut is representing the Galactic Republic. He's doing that kind of Star Trek thing where he's evaluating societies, seeing if they're worth being in, or if they're ready to be into the Galactic Republic. Comes along a planet, there's a blue race of robots and an orange, I believe it's orange race of robots, and there's a systemic bigotry against, I believe it's the orange race of robots, right? And in his evaluation, he gives his final evaluation and says that, this culture, given this bigotry and this hatred isn't ready to be included into the Galactic Republic. And this is 1955, so you got to think about the context. And then in the last panel of the comic, he removes his helmet, revealing that he's a black man and that he was the authority of the Republic and that kind of thing. And it became very controversial. It became an issue where the Comic Code, which is that internal agency that the comic publishers created to kind of avoid the government taking over, they tried to regulate themselves. They actually came in, and I believe it was Charles Murphy was the Comic Code administrator at the time, and demanded, just based off of that panel that reflected that the character was black, that it not be published.
Wow.
It did get published. It went ahead, but this is the interesting piece. You know, according to some of the research that I found, it was the last published comic by EC Comics. So they didn't publish any more comics after that. So I can't correlate that there was a retribution to the comic. But it's just interesting that your last comic, you know, was that one. But I think what that speaks to, and why I think it's an important one that may be known, but what I think we should think about is the power of comics. That power of that single panel of a black man. It creates a whole expansive universe that this black man comes from a black culture. There's other black people. That is not just this dominated colonization of space. So when you talk about people who live outside the earth, well, they automatically white. Like everybody on Krypton is automatically white. Superman's white, you know, that kind of thing. And so that was my little known one, but the one I want to jump into, because I think it really touches on what you talked about. I did a little research on this, and I know you may be familiar with it, and I don't know if it's in a collection, but the Golden Legacy historical comics.
Yes, in the collection.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's what's up, man. Yeah, I didn't have a chance to check and make sure we had it, but that's an amazing story. And I think the comics may be well known, but I think the story of Bertrand Fitzgerald isn't known as much as it should, because it taps into exactly what you were saying. Because when he decided to actually cultivate these comics, you know, he tried it out, couldn't get the funding, struggled with it, and he went to Coke with the numbers, with the statistics that said, per capita, black people are drinking more Coke than white people, you know. And so with those kind of statistics, he was able to gather the funding, gather the support to create some amazing comics of not just your standard Booker T. Washington. I mean, these were empowered Toussaint Louverture, the Amistad Rebellion. I mean, really kind of strong Black Power, resistance, Black Lives Matter kind of content that he created an amazing series that I'll just run through just a couple of them real quick. Of course, the Haitian Rebellion, which is represented, that was the very first one. The Crispus Attucks was number 3. So the conversation isn't a easy, you know, let's package Black history with the stories that make everybody feel comfortable. It really has some interesting stories about rebellion, fighting back against the system, both physically and mentally. So there's just an amazing series of comics. I'm so glad that's in the collection, man, because that's a power. Robert Smalls, which is the story of a Black man still in the Confederate boat. Those are stories that are powerful, and to have those introduced to you early in life kind of really can spark how you view Blackness and how you view Black history. And I think Bertrand Fitzgerald understood it. And I know he's been awarded, several of the Black comic conferences have like awarded this comic, you know, awards at various things. But that's going to be my one that I put up that, you know, you may know it, but go deep with it. Go deep with everything about it. Yeah.
I love that. And I'm just kind of reflecting back to my own younger days. I think that series was the first place I'd ever heard Matthew Henson being recognized, right?
Yeah.
That's the first time I'd ever heard about a Black man that was exploring the South Pole, right?
Right.
And that's a great choice and a pivotal one. I'd like to touch on that. We keep coming up with, as we're doing episodes, we come up with shows as we're doing shows. Yeah, but that's a deep one. That's a great pick.
Yeah, one of the ones that was really interesting too, that is a feature in one of the comics, is the women that did the I'm trying to think of the name of the movie. Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures, yeah.
Those characters are
Yes.
represented in one of the comics, and it's like those women are represented in one of the comics, and those are the kind of things like you're saying that it's never been that we lacked for stories. It's never
Yes.
been that we
Yes.
didn't have content or that kind of thing. And I
Yes.
just like the contextual way that comic just kind of shows. And we're talking about 69, well, it's like 65 through 70, something like that, where he was crafting this out. Tom Feelings, who is an amazing artist who does a lot of children's book illustrations, he worked with him and he brought in scholars to do the history and that kind of thing. So that's my one. I think people may know about it, but when we back open, man, that's when I think people could really go deep into.
I love it. You ended this on a high note. I appreciate that. So good. So thank you again for your time. As always, brother, it is great to talk to you. It's great to just tap into your knowledge, and I certainly appreciate your time. As always, I want to encourage everyone that's listening, all of you out there, to join us on social media. You can find us on any social media channel at SHIC Social, Superheroes in Color Social. Give us some of your lesser known titles, some of the things that you have encountered among your reading. Let us know what you think about our picks, and just interact with us and help us to grow and spread the word. Thank you again for your time. Make sure while you're in our social media channels, or you stop by superheroesincolor.com, make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. We're going to put image shots of everything that we've talked about today and some links for you to do some further reading. When Pray Tell the Library opens up, we invite you to come down and see some of these in real life. But until then, keep reading, family.